Pardon. Good evening. Please be seated. Please be seated. Welcome. Welcome. We are very happy that you turn up at this book talk this evening. And it's going to be, I'm sure, very, very interesting. I'm Jan Wouters. I'm the director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I'm happy also to be the administrator of the America-Europe Fund. You will find lots of propaganda here, banners and flyers and what have you. And with the America-Europe Fund, we are extremely delighted to welcome here, as we say in French, une sommité, a grand lady of European law, but far beyond European law, and that is Professor Anu Bradford of Columbia University. Professor Bradford is very, very well known, and I would be highly surprised if none of you had ever heard of her previous book, The Brussels Effect, because this is just like everybody knows about the book, everybody has read parts of the book. It's being discussed in so many of our courses and programs. And if you don't know about it, then maybe this introduction by her will also give you a kind of foretaste. But today's subject matter is slightly different from the Brussels effect. Let me first say a few more words about Professor Bradford. She is a leading scholar on EU regulatory power. She has lots of very interesting courses that she teaches at Columbia University, including not just on, say, European Union law, also on antitrust law, on digital economy regulation, comparative and international law. I mean, she is really one of the strongholds of the faculty of the School of Law of Columbia University. And apart from these very famous publications on the Brussels effect and lots of other worthwhile publications, she has just published this beautiful book with Oxford University Press, Digital Empires. In fact, there is a possibility to obtain the book with a nice discount for those of you who have the resources to do that. But this is, of course, just completely voluntary. And this is also not the goal of this evening's, event. Let me, actually, without much further ado, give the floor to Professor Bradford. You know that the book is essentially about a kind of regulatory battle between three main international players, the United States, China, and the European Union. All of these three powers are in an enormous kind of race to not just to regulate and develop their own standards with regard to technology and lots of other things, including artificial intelligence, but also they hope to have a dominant say in the development of international standards. And as you know, the relations between those three actors are somewhat challenging. The US has a particular take on China. You know that one of the very few things that today's United States has bipartisan agreement on is that they want to, in a way, constrain China, so that they really see China as a competitor, as a rival, and that the US absolutely does not want to give up its dominance or hegemony, if you want to say that. Also, the European Union, although it has a much more nuanced position on China, it sees it on the one hand as a competitor, on the other hand as a partner in certain areas like climate change. But since 2019, in the EU official documents, you also find the notion that China is a systemic rival, meaning that China is keen on changing the rules of global governance to its own liking. And that is indeed what we see increasingly in many, say, areas, not just technology, but also human rights, peace and security, sustainable development, and so on. So China is there and is really a factor to reckon with. And then there is, of course, the European Union, of which I don't want to say much here, but you know that the EU itself is also trying to team up and is trying to find its own position in this complicated world. You know also that there is, in a certain way, a special relationship between the EU and the United States in this particular area, because since the Biden administration, we have the so-called TTC, the Trade and Technology Council. And although some people are critical of the TTC and are saying, well, it's actually not that much more than a talking shop, I am not in full agreement with that, because there's a lot of valuable work going on within the TTC. They're going to have their 5th meeting later this year. And I think it's really a very important forum where the US and the EU can also try to converge on certain standards and find consensus on certain takes in line what they call their shared values, because this is one of the things that makes us slightly different from China, if I may say so. But it's high time we give the floor to the real expert, that's Professor Bradford. She's so much in demand that she has been giving so many talks that her voice has a little bit suffered. But with some good tea, it's all getting better. But so she will make like a 20-25 minute introduction, and then we will have a Q&A with all of you, so that I hope you can really engage with her. Professor Bradford, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that awfully kind introduction and for making me always so welcome to Leuven. And thank you all for joining this conversation. So let me start with what the main premise of the book is. So I start from this assumption that there's increasingly now globally a consensus that technology needs to be regulated. But there is no consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So in the book, I argue that there are 3 primary ways to think about digital governance. There is the American market-driven model, the Chinese state-driven model, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model. So the US market-driven model really prioritizes free market, free speech, incentives to innovate. So the government is reserved only a minimalist role, and the governance of technology is in practice handed over to the tech companies themselves. So it is a model of self-regulation, a techno-optimist, techno-libertarian view of the world. The Chinese, on the other hand, under their state-driven model, are very focused on making China a technological superpower, and they are prepared to leverage state resources to reach that goal. But China is also deploying technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in an effort to entrench the political power of the Communist Party and ensure social stability within the nation. So the Europeans are often in this debate portrayed as being forced to choose between the Chinese digital world and the American digital world, lacking a robust technology sector on their own. But in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not willing to, nor are they forced to, choose between China and the US. The Chinese model for the Europeans is simply too oppressive, but the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have articulated their own 3rd way of governing the digital economy, which is premised on a notion of a human-centric digital transformation, where the protection of the fundamental rights of individuals, the preservation of democratic structures of the society, and also an idea of a greater fairness characterizing the digital economy takes the center stage. So the Europeans are prepared to redistribute power away from the large platforms to smaller companies, to individuals, and to the society at large. So these are the 3 models that I hope analytically helps us clear out some of the fundamental choices that we are facing when we think about how we regulate digital economy. So they are based on a different relationship between the state and the market and the individual, and how these leading technology and regulatory powers are prioritizing those elements. But why do I then call these leading jurisdictions empires? So empires is a provocative word. It's a big word. That's why it's a thick book, because you cannot write a thin book with the title empires. But I think it also helps us conceptually to understand what's going on. Because none of the three regulatory models are confined to the boundaries of the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each empire is actively exporting its respective regulatory model. But they are exporting something different. So the Americans are primarily exporting the private power of their tech companies. They were set free to take over the world, and that is exactly what they have done. The US tech companies are everywhere. We are using their products and services in so many ways everywhere around the world. If I just take one example, Meta's Facebook has 3 billion users in 160 different countries. And through their presence, through the products and services that we are consuming, they are exporting that American market-driven ethos, which is part of their business model and part of their business culture. The Chinese are exporting primarily infrastructure power. So they are building 5G networks, data centers, undersea cables, smart cities, safe cities, exporting these surveillance technologies along the digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even many parts of Europe. So what are the Europeans then exporting? They are exporting the superpower they have, which is regulation. So this now ties to my earlier work on the Brussels effect. So Europe's ability to regulate the global marketplace simply by regulating the single market. So the EU is often the first one to regulate different domains of digital economy. So it may be hard to name a European tech company when you ask people, but they can all name the GDPR. So this is what the Europeans are known for. They regulate data privacy. And the GDPR was only the beginning. Then we have the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, now soon to be adopted, hopefully, the AI Act, the Data Act, Data Governance Act, the list just goes on. The Europeans are on this when it comes to regulation. And in many parts of the world, through the practices of global tech companies, these regulations then become global digital regulations. So now, if the first argument of the book is that Europe is also an empire, this is not just about China versus US. The second argument that I want you to think about is that we don't just see a splinternet, whereby the world would be neatly divided into these different digital spheres of influence. Instead, those spheres are often overlapping because each of the empire is contributing a different layer to the global digital governance. You have many markets where you have US tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and European regulations present at the same time. So when you then have multiple empires present in third markets, non-aligned markets, then you also see these empires clash. And this is why we see these battles. So in the book, I spent a lot of time talking about battles, and I think it helps us to think about two different types of battles. We witness horizontal battles and vertical battles. The horizontal battles are the battles between the empires themselves, most prominent one being the US-China tech war, which is a battle for technological supremacy. It is not just a battle of technology, it's an economic battle, geopolitical battle, ideological battle, and even a military battle. But then we also have a lot of battles between the US and the EU, which are often in the domain of regulation, where the US tech companies have come to the European Union and the Europeans feel that they are exploiting European data, are dominating the marketplace, abusing their dominance of their marketplace, and are in many ways in the need of being reined in. So then the Europeans feel that American companies are overreaching, they are taking too much, they're giving too little, and are then asserting regulatory powers to rein them in, which then leads the Americans to say, no, it's not our companies overreaching, it's your regulators that are overreaching. And that is often then the transatlantic battle. But at the same time, we are witnessing those transatlantic battles. We also witnessing all empires engaging in vertical battles within their jurisdictions, trying to regulate the tech companies. So we see increasingly the governments being of the view that we do need to regulate these companies, and they are then engaging in these vertical battles. But those two levels of battles, the horizontal and the vertical ones, are interlinked, which introduces elements of restraint to this battle. So now the Americans are reconsidering whether they ought to abandon their techno-libertarian view and also start regulating their tech companies. But that conversation on whether to regulate the tech companies takes place in the shadow of the China-US tech war, which means that the Americans cannot fully engage with full force into that vertical battle, because then they would be eroding the very asset that they need in the horizontal battle to prevail against China. So we see less vertical regulation than we would see if it wasn't for the need to engage in this competition with China. So let me now move to the question that probably interests most of you, which is who wins? So what happens in these battles? Who wins the horizontal battle and who wins the vertical battle? And here I make a few predictions. My first prediction is that the American digital empire is declining. The US is losing the regulatory battle. Increasingly, the world is of the view that the market-driven regulatory model is ill-suited to govern today's digital economy. Tech companies cannot be left to their own devices. They have failed us repeatedly and spectacularly. And if we continue to let them do so, they will do so. So all around the world, now individuals and governments are moving away from this idea that they could trust the tech companies. But even the US itself, as I was mentioning, is now questioning whether they can really trust these companies in practice. So if that is the case, if the American model is losing, it's good news for the Europeans, because that means that the European model is actually gaining at the expense of the US model. So governments in democratic world are increasingly coalescing behind a variant of the European rights-driven model, which is seen as best advancing public interest, protecting democracy and the rights of individuals, and reining in this excessive corporate power. So the European victory, though, comes with a few caveats, and I have three potential or real concerns that I want to raise and have you think about. So first is this concern that even though the governments are conceding now that the Europeans are probably in the right side of history in recognizing many of the harms associated with digital economy, there is a concern of European innovation and a concern whether that model is consistent with technological progress. So even when Americans are considering of moving towards the EU model, they are asking themselves, are we then going to become like Europe? What happens to our tech sector? What happens to all these innovations that have generated so much wealth for our economy? And they would argue to the world. So here I want to argue against the idea that somehow Europeans' inability to compete with the Americans in the domain of technology should be attributed to digital regulation. I am deeply concerned about the state of European innovation. We do have a problem, but I don't think the problem is the GDPR. Even if we were to scrap the GDPR today, tell in Brussels for everybody to walk away from the trilogue on AI and just don't pass the AI Act, it's not that you would see a thriving tech economy emerge from European countries in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Something else is going on that is much more fundamental in explaining why the US is doing so much better than the Europeans. But just think about this. Actually, digital regulation is very new in the EU. There was hardly any digital regulation before 2010, when the EU started its competition cases against Google. The data protection directive was pretty weak. It was only with the 2016 GDPR when we really ramped up to the gears of regulation. And yet, even then, Europe was behind the US. In the years when Google and Facebook were founded, 1998 and 2004, there was hardly any digital regulation here, yet those companies were founded in the US and not in the EU. So what, in my view, then explains that the US is doing so much better? First, there is no integrated digital single market in the EU. these tech companies still have a hard time scaling across the EU because they are facing very different regulatory and just generally market environments across the EU. Some of that is linguistic. It was much easier to start Amazon as a bookseller in the US when there was a uniform demand for English-speaking books. We read books in many different languages, which makes it much harder. But there's also a lot of legal barriers, the kind of legal requirements that differ from one member state to another, and that makes it very hard for European tech companies to scale. Second, capital. The US has incredibly robust venture capital market. It is very easy to fund your innovations in the US. There is no complete capital markets union in the EU. The capital markets are fragmented. They are shallow, and it's very hard for a Belgian company to go and raise funds in Finland, in Portugal, in Germany, and elsewhere. So that, I think, is much more important. This is, again, not the GDPR story. It's not that Europeans are committed to rights. No, they are just not sufficiently committed to building efficient capital markets. Third, bankruptcy laws and attitudes towards risk-taking. It is almost fatal to fail in Europe. If you fail as an entrepreneur and you go through bankruptcy, you don't raise money easily again. Whereas in the US, it's just like a rite of passage. You try hard things, you fail, and then they throw more money at you so you can try again. It is a country that believes in second chances. It has the laws that help for individuals to get the second chance. So entrepreneurs are able to take risks because they know it's not the end if they fail. And we need our entrepreneurs to do really hard things, to pursue really disruptive innovations. And that requires an attitude shift and a legal shift towards insolvency. Because there's a lot of stigma around failure in Europe, but there is no such stigma in the US. A fourth, and this is a really important, I think, you cannot innovate unless you have innovators. And the US has been so much better than Europe in harnessing the world's best talent. They have a proactive immigration policy that ensures that the US is getting the world's best talent to US universities, and then those individuals stay and benefit the US labor market. I'll just give you a few examples. If you look at the over $1 billion startups, so unicorns, in the US, over 50% of them have an immigrant founder. If we focus for a moment just on the household name, the tech platforms that we all know, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, son of a Syrian immigrant. The founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, second-generation Cuban. The founder of Tesla, Elon Musk, South African. The co-founder of Facebook, Eduardo Saverin, Brazilian. The co-founder of Google, Sergey Brin, Russian. This is not just, again, a story of the GDPR holding the Europeans back. It's that the Americans have an advantage in tapping into the world's best talent, including European best talent. So those, to me, are much more powerful ways to rebut the argument that if the US were to move towards the European rights-driven model and pass a federal data privacy law, for instance, that wouldn't dismantle the US capital markets. That wouldn't prevent the global talent from finding their way to the US. So this is my long way of trying to persuade you that I don't think the European victory, the victory for the European model, comes at the cost of innovation. I am much less worried of over-regulation in Europe and much more worried about under-regulation. I think the Europeans are not doing good enough in regulating. We are very good at passing regulations, but there is no good enforcement and implementation. That's where a lot more work needs to be done. And it is hard. Digital economy is complex. These companies are extremely powerful. And digital economy is very hard to regulate. But that is, I think, a huge challenge for Europe. A third challenge for the victory of the European model. European model may indeed have great appeal in the democratic world. It has very little appeal in the authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning world. And that world is growing by a day. Every day we have more and more countries sliding towards authoritarianism. They have no interest in the right-driven model. They like what they see with the Chinese model. They want the political control that comes with the Chinese model. And it is very hard then for us, Europeans, or then Americans, to then try to counter that Chinese model for a couple of reasons. And I give you just two. One is this infrastructure power is very, very crucial. China is providing many of the developing countries a path to digital development. And there is no alternative. Why would you ask then these countries to say no to Chinese infrastructure? They need that infrastructure. That infrastructure is pretty good and it is affordable. In part because under the state-driven model, the Chinese government is subsidizing the financing of that infrastructure. And the European companies cannot compete with that. But that is one thing also. We say that, well, if you take our infrastructure, you're not going to be surveilled by Beijing. You have more privacy. You talk to these people in many of these countries and they say, look, privacy is not my number 20, number 50 concern. I need development. And privacy is your European luxury concern. I don't have a luxury to wake up in the morning and think how much privacy I have today. So that's one thing. Then there's another reason why it's very hard to counter the Chinese model. And this was something when I was writing this in the book, I was very uncomfortable writing it. But I had to write it because I think it is true. China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have managed to create a thriving tech economy without being politically free. And no matter how much I like to think that all the good things flow from liberal democracy, it is hard to go to those countries and say that, look, if you choose the Chinese model, you get control, but you will not see economic growth. You will not see innovation. They look at China and they say, well, it seems like I can have both. And that also makes it harder to counter the Chinese model. Now, here's my one caveat. The Chinese companies are trailing behind the US quite significantly in generative AI. One reason being that the generative AI is challenging the censorship regime, which means that in China, you need to limit the data that is used to train those models and what output these generative AI models can create, because they need to be consistent with the message of the Communist Party, and that reduces their ability to perform at the same level. So there may be an element, an aspect of the tech economy where we can feel vindicated that yes, ultimately when you are free, you do innovate more. But it's very hard to look at China now and say that Chinese don't know how to innovate. So let me now use this as a segue to my final set of remarks, which is that I want to emphasize that what to me is the most important battle of all. And that is the battle for the future of liberal democracy. That's where the stakes are the highest, and that's the battle that liberal democracies must really focus on winning. And I want to remind how liberal democracy can deteriorate one of two ways. So one is if the EU and the US indeed lose the horizontal battle to China, and the world is turning more digital authoritarian. But liberal democracy also can deteriorate if the US and EU lose their vertical battle to the tech companies. And that is also not the governance model that is consistent with liberal democracy. And I worry about this because Americans, because of the dysfunction of the US Congress, have a very hard time legislating on digital economy. Chinese government doesn't have a hard time legislating. The Europeans are good at legislating, but they have a hard time enforcing their regulations. The Chinese government doesn't have a hard time enforcing. If the Chinese Communist Party says that it's time to crack down on big tech, the Chinese Communist Party will crack down on the big tech. So the challenge is whether liberal democracies, including the EU, can show to the world and to itself that there is a liberal democratic way to govern technology. If not, we'd be forced to concede that digital economies either governed by authoritarians, whereby democratic governments are destined to fail in that same endeavor, or they are governed by tech companies, which means that the true digital empires are the authoritarians or the tech companies. And that is not a conclusion that anybody who believes in liberal democracy as a foundation of a digital society and human engagement should be comfortable with. So that is my call for action. That is my warning. That is my reminder of what is at stake when we are asking the question of how we are regulating digital economy in places like Europe, so that that ideological victory in the democratic world is not a hollow one, and that there is a way still to steer the world as large towards the values that we think is ultimately serving better the digital future that we have. So let me end it there, and I'd be delighted to take questions. Maybe I'll...
So thank you so much for this enlightening introduction, which really shows how comprehensive and balanced the analysis in your book really is. We're now going to make our session really interactive. So we have on both sides of the auditory walking microphone people, and I'm going to invite you to make a comment, questions, anything you always wanted to ask about technology but didn't dare to do until now. So please go ahead. Who breaks the ice? There you go. Can you also mention your name?
Hello, my name is Amadeo, and I have a question. How do you account for the differences in sizes of the economies in their battle to regulate the world?
So the size of the economy matters in a couple of ways. So one is that you can just look at the size of the tech industry. So you look at in that battle of whether you are producing significant tech companies. And for instance, if you measure the country's AI capabilities, so that's important in the horizontal battle between the US and China. So there you are looking at, I think, the 4 components that are important in AI leadership. One is that you have access to data, so how much data you have access to. And then you have access to talent, and you have access to hard power. You basically have the hardware, the computing power that is needed to train and run these models, and then that you have institutions that are capable of actually adapting these technologies. So you can use that kind of metrics. But then when it comes to regulatory power, what matters is not just how much you're producing technology, whether you are the destination for technology, whether you are large enough of a market that the companies need to abide by your rules. And it's very helpful that Europe is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. So about 450 million consumers. And let me say why it matters that it's also GDP per capita that is high, is that any platform whose business model relies on advertising, they need to recognize that the advertising revenue, per user advertising revenue, is much higher on wealthier markets. So Facebook makes a lot more money with the one European user than with one Indian user. So that also matters a lot. So you do look at sometimes the GDP, but you also look at the GDP per capita. So what is your purchasing power, the demand side of it? But then sometimes it matters also whether you are a producer of technology. So that's how partially you count for the size of the country. And those of you who have read the Brussels Effect or are interested in the Brussels Effect, what is one foundational element of that is that you need to be large enough of a market. You cannot be Costa Rica and say that, okay, we're going to be now the super regulator, because the tech companies can just say, okay, that's expensive for me, so I'm not going to operate in Costa Rica. But they still have a very hard time saying that they cannot operate in the European Union.
Sorry for the Costa Ricans in the room.
I'm always cheering for small countries. I'm from Finland, so.
There's somebody high there, but there is already a successor down here as well.
Thank you for your speech. It was very interesting. I was wondering, how would you articulate the sustainability regulatory battles with the technological battles? Are they similar, are they different, and how?
The sustainability battles?
Yes.
Very interesting. So I think there are certain interlinkages, and partially the race for technology is a challenge for sustainability because it requires this computing power that is required for these most powerful generative AI models, consumes a ton of energy. So I think that's one issue that they can be in direct tension. But then if you think about that, there's also this battle also to develop sustainable sort of technologies, including electric vehicles, where I think the two sectors pretty well then intersect as well. So that's where there is a lot of also kind of a technological race to capture the big market share, where it is about technology, but it's also about electric vehicles as means of sustainable technologies. But I think there's something about the nature of the tech as such, as opposed to sort of sustainability differences among these countries. So first of all, we are still able to negotiate about climate change with China. I don't think we are going to reach a substantive AI treaty with China. And partially the reason is that when it comes to climate change, it is a massive threat for the world, but it does require a different perspective than if you think about some domains of technology that are directly relevant to military power, sort of the geopolitical power, which elevates the stakes when it comes to technologies like semiconductors and technologies like AI, which can be used in the future as autonomous weapons, for instance. And I think that really makes it even harder to have an agreement or detente when it comes to technology, as opposed to some battles in the sustainability domain.
Wow, thank you for that. Ambassador Wouters, the co-chair of the America-Europe Fund.
Thank you, Professor Wouters, and thank you so much for your very powerful remarks and also your powerful answers to the questions to now. I was listening very carefully also to your conclusions, and I was thinking that from a European point of view, if policymakers would be asked to define the right policy adjusted to the conclusions of your book, they would have a hell of a job and it would be very challenging. And and starting from there, I was thinking of the following question for you. From the European point of view, it may be a bit critical what I'm saying, but I mean, what is the point for the EU at this stage to focus so much on regulation as long as there is no international consensus on what you should exactly regulate eventually, as long as there's no stronger industrial base and technology base for ourselves, if I may speak as a European, and as long as we don't arrive among the member states in the negotiation on the legislation to put more effectiveness and maybe more enforcement instruments in it. So I hope the only answer will not be that's because what the Commission is doing. I mean, legislating, and that's their instrument. But in terms of defining the right policy, why doing that? So putting so much emphasis on regulation at this stage. Yeah. And then maybe if there is time left, artificial intelligence is debated everywhere. In society, universities, all diplomatic summits, it's incredible. Do you see a chance, observing all these debates, that for artificial intelligence, we will arrive at an international consensus on what should be regulated? Or does international intelligence follow the same analysis and conclusions of your book?
Yeah. So very good, thank you so much. So why the Europeans are regulating so much, especially when there is no international consensus? I think they're regulating so much exactly because there is no international consensus. Europeans need to rely on unilateralism. They need to take a charge. They can't sit back and expect the UN to solve this, or the WTO to solve this, or any other institution to solve this. So the Europeans need to regulate for the benefit of Europe, potentially with the side benefit of helping the rest of the world. I think this is extremely important. I'm a huge proponent of the regulatory agenda for several reasons. I am very worried about disinformation undermining democratic institutions. So next year, we are gearing up to over 50 national elections around the world. We have US presidential elections, a lot of consequential elections. We have European Parliament elections. We have elections in the UK, India, Indonesia, Mexico. These are big. And now when we have new AI tools to amplify the already rampant disinformation, and when we as a humanity are starting to really have a hard time distinguishing truth from falsehoods, I really worry what happens to these institutions. So I think this is absolutely urgent to have that ambitious regulatory agenda. I worry about many other aspects that this regulatory agenda is trying to accomplish, including mass surveillance. So I think privacy matters. These are powerful tools to invade our private lives. I'm worried about this excessive concentration. These tech companies have become so powerful that we are really struggling to take the power back from these companies. They have so much economic power, political power, societal power, cultural power, that they're really shaping every aspect of our societies. So I think it is urgent for the Europeans to push forward with regulation. But then comes the question, the second part of your question is that should not come at the expense of focusing on also building true European capabilities, especially in today's geopolitical world, where we cannot rely on that international cooperation and international supply chains. So we had maximized our tech supply chains we have built our tech supply chains to maximize efficiency and not resilience. And now we have noticed that we are too dependent on many players, including US and Chinese technologies. And the Europeans are desperate to become technologically more sovereign. So there's a huge pursuit of strategic autonomy, technological sovereignty, digital sovereignty. And here I have a great worry. I understand where this striving for technological supremacy comes from, and I think Europeans need to build truly European technological capabilities. Hence my call for digital single market, the capital markets union, the bankruptcy laws, the talent, and so forth. Instead, the conversation in Brussels seems to be now moving towards industrial policy, that we are somehow subsidizing our way to competitiveness and greater sovereignty. We are putting over 40 billion so that we are no longer 90%, but we are 80% dependent on foreign semiconductors. I hate to break it, but we're going to run out of money first. Before the Chinese, and this is Beijing's game. They played this for a much longer time and they play it better. And Americans are going to also outdo us there. So I think we really need to make sure that we pursue this legislative agenda, but don't let that sap all the energy and ambition from this effort to build European capabilities, but then not lean too heavily on this techno-protectionism. Because one warning that I want to share is that anybody who takes the Brussels effect seriously needs to realize that it is a tool to export good and bad regulations alike. If we now decide to harness our regulatory policy for data localization, for building national champions, so use our merger control to ban foreign acquisitions of European targets, guess what happens when you have a Belgian company going to Brazil and trying to acquire a company there? They may like their national champions just fine too. So we cannot overplay our hand and get more than we bargained for and become the biggest exporter of techno-protectionism around the world. So this is one fear that I have, is that let's not forget what is our strength. It is the commitment to rights. It is the commitment to protect our societies from the harmful uses of technology. So the goal is not to crush these companies. The goal is to make sure that ultimately they remain beholden to governments. And they will be acting in a way that is consistent with the public interest, while also making money alongside. That's okay, but ultimately they also need to make sure they don't threaten our democracies and undermine our rights. So I kind of endorse your concern, but I have a somewhat more sort of complex or multifaceted response to it, which continues to defend the regulation, continues to warn against protectionism, and really puts the competitiveness agenda at the center of conversation at the same time.
Thank you very much for this very nuanced view. I'm sure people from the Commission will be delighted to hear this, and we have some distinguished people working in the European Commission in the audience as well. There are questions there, but also over there. So the mic will reach you in the end.
Yes, hello. I had a question about the horizontal-vertical link that you talked about.
Yeah.
You said specifically that within the horizontal competition between the US and China, that it could potentially undermine the vertical regulation as well, because why would the United States would tread very carefully to affect its crown jewels, for example?
Yeah.
But I wanted to challenge you a bit on this logic. Wouldn't that effect could be the other way around as well? Because you saw with TikTok, for example, privacy and data protection suddenly became a very salient point, and suddenly you had this bipartisan commission talking about it. So TikTok is just one, but maybe more Chinese companies will spring up, and then suddenly privacy data is a very interesting topic to look at. So horizontal competition could enhance vertical regulation in that case.
Love that comment. Very good. So if we think about TikTok in the US, this is a really interesting new territory for the US because they are adamant about free speech. But then suddenly now they are prepared to potentially limit the free speech if it's moderated by TikTok. The US has two concerns about TikTok. One is the concern that TikTok has access to a ton of Americans' data. And the concern is that that data is passed on to Beijing. So onwards to Beijing. And ultimately then the Chinese Communist Party will be able to exert leverage over the US and utilize the data. The second concern is that the Chinese Communist Party can meddle with the algorithms that moderate the content and basically engage in propaganda and influence how Americans think. So those are the two concerns. And Americans now have been responding to this by President Trump tried to ban TikTok. You know what happened? TikTok took the US government to the court and prevailed. So TikTok wasn't banned. So that, I think, shows a strategy that is not available for American companies in China that cannot do business in China, that basically cannot then take the Chinese government to independent courts in China and expect to prevail. So ultimately, the US tech companies, there's no reciprocity. They basically need to, most of them have backed off from the Chinese market. Apple is still deriving about 20% of its revenue from there, partially because they are in hardware business. So TikTok is, I think, an interesting element of how the concerns that are horizontal should be really giving the reason for the US to regulate in a vertical sense and pass a federal privacy law that would be a much more principled way to regulate TikTok. Yet they don't seem to be getting there. Instead, they only keep fighting on the horizontal battle and try to ban TikTok. But also then they are trying to, maybe it's a diagonal battle, so they're also trying to then, they battle a Chinese tech company. But they are having a hard time doing it, partially because the US courts have come to rescue of TikTok. So there's still elements of the US government that is resisting that very vigorous battle. And I think there's genuine concern that the American commitment to First Amendment that gives a very expansive right to free speech ultimately makes it impossible to fight that vertical battle. But I really like the way that you challenge that there is also an incentive that the US should really follow through that flows from the horizontal battle. I realize that I did not respond to your second question about AI. Do you want me to do that now, or we take some other questions first? So maybe I say a few words on the AI. I think, as a dedicated diplomat, I think you have rightly, and I hope you do have faith in international cooperation, but at the same time, and I've been encouraged to see that we have some efforts to conduct international conversations about AI governance. So we have the Hiroshima process, the G7 under the leadership of Japan that came up with a code of conduct. The UN has now nominated an advisory body to look at potential way of having a UN agency and manage some of the global risks. We have the OECD has engaged in conversations about AI. We had the UK host an AI summit that led into a declaration that was signed, including by China and the US and the EU. So that is all good, and I think it's helpful. But let me temper those expectations. We are very far from having anything meaningful agreed in the international level. So we can all agree on we need to work on this. We need to have greater transparency, accountability, and we would like to have more sort of understanding of how these AI systems work. But we're very far from bridging those differences. So these are still voluntary codes of conduct. But I think what they have is that, first of all, we still have a better understanding of the differences. These conversations create greater momentum for every country, every government to engage in a vertical battle within their own jurisdictions, because they create a momentum for regulation, a sense that there are others who are regulating as well. So in that sense, I think there's a benefit. So you have a continuing dialogue. You don't want to go to the next meeting and say, well, we haven't gotten anything done, if you expect everybody else to work on this. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily have anything approaching a beginning of an AI treaty.
Okay, please go ahead.
Well, my question was mainly about like the cross-border data protection, especially between Europe and China, because well, we know that between like in Europe we have a very different history than USA. About the vertical effect, we didn't have in Europe on 11th of September. We didn't have a Snowden case, so we are not so concerned about the government control about people. But we tried to address this problem, for example, with the privacy shield. Mm-hmm. We had some problem. We had the Schrems case, for example, but we tried to do so. But well, I don't see this kind of effort between Europe and China, because I only know at the moment that China tried to take as a model the GDPR. He made like his own GDPR, less strict, more open. I think it's like directed to all the private companies and not only to the ones that treat a big amount of personal data.
Yeah.
But well, my question is, in your opinion, will be in the future possible, or it will be there will be this effort to trying to regulate the data protection between Europe and China?
Yeah, very good. It's actually something that I've thought about recently, asking why are we transferring any data to China? Are we comfortable doing that at all? So currently how we do it, we use these standard contractual clauses. So the companies that need to verify that the data is in principle, even though there's not the GDPR type of adequacy regime, that the Chinese privacy law does not meet the same standards because of various exceptions for political reasons, that would be a concern for Europeans. So individual companies can still challenge transfer data. But one reason we don't talk about it as much as the data protection case, data protection and data flows between the US is that we just haven't had the European Court of Justice cases like that the Schrems has brought against the US. We haven't had those challenges, and I would love to see what the court says about those standard contractual clauses that are used to govern the data flows between the EU and China. And I think that's going to be increasingly an issue. The EU has hardened its stand against China significantly over the last 2 years. This was a major rift between the US and the EU, where the US was being much more hard or much more hawkish in its approach towards China and was trying to get the Europeans to play along. But the Europeans have deeper economic engagement with the Chinese market. Germany, for instance, was very vulnerable if German companies couldn't fully take advantage of the market, and the Europeans were hedging, sort of willing to still engage with the Chinese market. But that shifted. I would mark the speech by Commission President von der Leyen on de-risking, and that came in the aftermath. I think what really changed the European view was Chinese refusal to condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine. That, I think, gave Europeans also the narrative that this is a really big dividing line, and they are actively supporting another authoritarian that is now waging a war on the European territory. But then there's this sort of bigger question, what we do with the data flows and the concerns over surveillance. So the Europeans have our own history, which explains why we are so concerned about privacy. So we know through our history how the Nazis got the information of Jews, by breaking the data privacy and having access to that private information. East German surveillance under Stasi is still something that the Europeans can relate to, and Americans don't have that history, so they are not as concerned. We don't have the same degree of surveillance that very capacious governments like the US has. But Edward Snowden revealed to us that we were also surveilled, and that led to these concerns about data being transferred to the US. And let me be very clear, China is not the only country engaged in surveillance. US is engaged in extensive surveillance. And that, I think, gave the Europeans a lot of pause. But let me now say something that may sound like controversial, so let me preface that with reminding you that I'm very committed to fundamental right to data privacy. That does not mean that the optimal amount of surveillance is zero. And Europeans have also benefited tremendously from US surveillance when it comes to Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that surveillance has been very helpful in trying to understand what the Russians are doing with the aggression. So Europeans are often free riding on US surveillance, and it often does help the Europeans. So I think just the question here too, in today's geopolitical environment, when we need to see technology through the lens of national security, some of the hardest questions is what does optimal de-risking look like? How far can we decouple from China? But also it does require us potentially, and this is my invitation to you, I'm not lecturing you, I'm asking you to ask yourself whether we need to be sometimes more pragmatic and less absolutist in some of our convictions, because we just cannot afford to be as committed to be free traders. I've always been very huge proponent of open markets, but I do realize that we are facing a very different geostrategic environment where we do need to think about de-risking. But we are also facing massive national security threats where surveillance is an important part of trying to fend off and prepare for those threats. So do we need to somehow think anew of how can we use our data in ways that serve our legitimate law enforcement and national security interests? And can it be done in the way that still remains consistent with our commitment to data privacy? The same way that we're not gonna ever win this battle for technological competitiveness, and if we are not comfortable with also utilizing data. That is a massive asset in the global digital economy. Can we find a GDPR consistent way of anonymizing the data and harnessing also for the benefit of European companies and European governments? And this is what we're trying to do with the common European data spaces, that we are able to trust the companies also transferring our data. So I would like here to invite you to think that there is a way that we can keep committed to our rights-driven agenda, but we are open to have a really important conversation also of how do we manage the challenges to our competitiveness that require us to be comfortable of seeing data also as a raw material in AI development. Nobody can develop AI without data. So can we do that? And a lot of conversation should be how do we do it in a way that allows us to get the economic benefits and remain committed to privacy, and the same thing with national security.
Thank you. Please.
Sorry, my mistake. Thank you very much. It's very much an honor to listen to you and these insights. I wanted to ask, so as you mentioned, there is this proposed EU AI Act, which is still in trialogue, and it has this risk-based and very normative approach, right, which would be something that the EU is trying to export, this normative power. And I'm questioning also in regards to the Brussels effect, and how far do you think the EU AI Act is possible in converting these norms and values to other countries? So for example, as you mentioned, and is written in your book about the digital infrastructure China is exporting, but there's also European companies that are exporting surveillance tech to, for example, Xinjiang. Do you think the AI Act is, or the proposed act will be influential enough to really make the EU a normative actor in this regard?
So first step would be for the EU to now internally resolve its differences and get through this dialogue. So I don't know whether many of you have focused on this, but there's been a couple of bumps along the road. And the EU is supposed to finalize its trilogue negotiations in December. The next big meeting is December 6th. But there was a really big event. Was it a week ago, 2 weeks ago? Not only the whole Sam Altman saga in the OpenAI, but then there was a consensus between France and Germany and Italy. They issued a non-paper that basically called for removal of the foundation models from the scope of the binding AI Act, and we basically would have a code of conduct. The representatives of the European Parliament basically walked out of the meeting, or at least that was reported, and it is not something that is acceptable for the European Parliament. It is very hard for them to say that was a red line, that was crossed, and it's very hard to see that they could somehow agree politically to make such a big concession. So right now there's been a massive deadlock in the negotiations, and if the EU really wants to be a leader in this domain, it really needs to now accept that there are certain domains of regulation where the pragmatic philosophy is that you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Regulating something right now and not delaying this is extremely valuable. And there needs to be a way to pull some parts to the annexes so that they're easier to revise. There's no way we can now write an AI Act that is going to be future-proof. This needs to be revised, but not doing anything, there's a cost in waiting. So first of all, the Europeans really need to now seize this moment because they were ahead of the game by far. And now many others are closing ranks. The US came up with an executive order over 100 pages tasking over 25 agencies with a bunch of ways to regulate AI. So it is not as powerful as the EU's AI Act because it is still an executive order, which you are probably not as familiar what it means in the US context, but it could be overturned. We have a presidential election next year. We have no idea what happens to executive orders. They can be challenged in the court. I'm not sure how vulnerable this one is, but still many parts of that depends on how effectively the agencies will implement them. So it tasks the agencies, and then often they are asked to develop guidance. And many of that guidance is voluntary. So I don't think the US is at the point of eclipsing the Europeans as the primary regulator, unless the Europeans are now themselves unraveling the legislative effort. So then still the idea that now assume the Europeans are reaching a consensus, and Europeans have reached consensus on harder things. This is not the hardest things they've ever done. And I think there's a massive political pressure to get this done. If this gets pushed to the next European Parliament elections, we'll be back to the zero, and it's very difficult to do that. So I think the Europeans, my prediction, they will get this done. I don't know at what price and how diluted it will be, but I think it will get done. So then there is a question whether it will generate the Brussels effect. So a lot of countries around the world are now looking for the best way to regulate. So there's increasingly a sense that AI needs guardrails, and that will be the only one that is comprehensive, binding AI Act. China has moved towards binding regulation, but they have much more piecemeal, like an incremental approach to address elements of AI, but that will be an obvious model to follow in many parts of the world. So I think it could have a de jure Brussels effect by having several legislators copied. And it could also have a de facto Brussels effect because the more data you have, the more powerful your models are. And the companies have an incentive to then create AI systems for broader markets as opposed to retraining them from Europe to other markets so that they could evade the EU's AI Act provisions elsewhere. So somewhat longer answer just because I wanted for everybody to be aware of how important political moment there is right now in Brussels trying to close the ranks in these final stages of the AI Act.
Thank you. As said, we have distinguished representatives from the European Commission in the audience, and there is Dr. Amaryllis Verhoeven, who is head of unit of the Digital Transformation of Industry and Deputy Director in DG GROW. So we're very happy to have you among us, Amaryllis, so please.
Okay, Jan, there is no way to come incognito to this event, but that's fine. Hi. I just have a question. So, of course, we are very proud in Europe about our capacity to regulate. We believe in what we're doing in the regulation front. I am fully with you when it comes to the challenges to innovation and the root cause, which is our failing single market, which is still too fragmented. That's music to our ears. We need to absolutely step up the efforts. Having said that, I'm a little bit surprised to hear you speak a bit negatively about industrial policy as a lever also. Because I don't think it is sustainable for Europe in the longer run to just say, we will regulate the world, and we will just then get the tech from wherever it is being produced, but not in Europe, obviously. We also want to be part of the game at least parts and parcels of the game. We can't maybe, copy the platform model, but maybe we can be leaders in other parts of technology. God knows. And there, industrial policy does come in. And you mentioned a couple of examples, the data spaces. That's part of industrial policy. Talent is also part and parcel of industrial policy because there is public funding concerned here. That goes also into that. So is there a way to distinguish between acceptable industrial policy and maybe industrial policy which is indeed going completely in the protectionist mode and might eventually backfire? So happy to have your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. I think it's one of those, when I say it, one of the hardest questions for the next commission is to define what does optimal decoupling look like? Because I think it's a really hard thing to get right. I think in many ways then the question is what does, and the way you've been trying to define open strategic autonomy, what is acceptable industrial policy? Exactly the right way to ask the question. And I think we probably don't disagree. It's just how we define industrial policy. And if you say that industrial policy is investment in education because the criteria is to use public funding, yes, I'm pro-industrial policy. If it is much more investment in research, yes, I'm for industrial policy. If we think about migration is part of I would call that industrial strategy, but it is not something that I am worried about as a protectionist move. I am much more worried about that we are leaning too heavily in subsidy races. So subsidy races concern me a great deal. I don't think we are going to get there by trying to spend public money in building these capabilities. So I think that's the kind of what I say unacceptable industrial policy, at least as an exclusive strategy or too dominant strategy or too expensive strategy. And it's very hard for me to think about how we can sort of create winners. The French government tried to subsidize a competitor to Google. That did not go well. It tried to even mandate the French agencies to use the French search engine. Nobody wanted to use that. Wasn't as good of a search engine. That was a lot of wasted money. So that, I think, what worries me a great deal, that we are now moving to the territory where the game can only be played by France and Germany and other large member states. And small member states can't win the subsidy races. And we are further unraveling the single market if we are distorting it with massive subsidies. So I would really single out the subsidies as a sort of one aspect that I am very cautious. At the same time, I recognize in the book that even though Americans are committed to market-driven model, and I was endorsing their commitment to venture capital, there's also a lot of state funding. If you think about the origins of the US tech industry, there's a lot of Department of Defense funding. The Department of Defense has this agency called DARPA. They provided funding for ARPANET. That was a predecessor to Internet. They provided money for Apple that eventually led to iPhone. But if you look at, there's a wonderful book by Margaret O'Mara called The Code, sort of the history of the Silicon Valley, but also the history of these public institutions and subsidies. They were distributed in a very market-driven way. And I'm not sure the Europeans are as committed in conducting it in such a market-driven spirit. And that, I think, worries me. So I think there is, I think we just probably disagree on the definition of industrial policy, and so that we are all comfortable with the kind of industrial policy we talk about. I worry about pursuing data localization as a solution to keeping us more secure. I worry about revising merger control as the way to build European champions. I worry about expensive, misdirected subsidy races. But we do need, and we generally don't have the EU-level budgets to carry out these massive industrial policy initiatives, which is why we've thus far done it through regulation. But I am open to thinking about issues more strategically when we also think about our industrial competitiveness. But I think, for instance, completing the Capital Markets Union, completing the digital single market, that is much more effective than trying to find the funds to subsidize. And we have so many needs for funding in the EU. We're trying to fund the green transition, the digital transformation, the global gateway so that there's alternative to China in Africa. We're trying to somehow pay for our social security systems and demographic challenges that we have. We're trying to rebuild our armies. We're trying to rebuild Ukrainian armies, and we need to fund rebuilding Ukraine. Americans won't do that. At some point, somebody needs to tell me, how are we going to do that? Yes, let's do also semiconductors, let's do AI, let's do batteries, let's do cloud. We do not have the money to do that. And nothing gets distributed unless we have growth. And now growth takes place unless we have innovation. And no innovation takes place unless we really invest on those fundamental blocks of European competitiveness. That's not only industrial policy.
Anu, I really think you should become the next Finnish commissioner. But so yes, great debates, and there are still questions. Of course, I wanted to raise an issue that we should probably not forget, especially when we looked at the United States with their, say, initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a massive scheme, of course, but consisting mainly of tax breaks. And there we touch upon intrinsic limitations of the European Union, which you know very well. The EU basically doesn't really have tax competences. So how would you deal with that? Are you in favor of such a scheme of tax incentives? Is this something Europe should learn from? And then the big nitty-gritty EU law question is, how could the EU even do that?
No, I think there's one way to subsidize is just to give money. The other one is that you just basically don't tax companies. And that's sort of the other side of the coin. So if I'm worried about distorting single market because of state aid, I am also concerned about tax breaks. But at the same time, the US has been very successful with the IRA and with its other, when they go big, and they actually can be very, very effective. So in terms of how do you, I still see that there is a way to have extra support in some domains where the private markets don't provide the full support for developing certain industries, and that's when you can do it partially through tax breaks, and where there are massive externalities that are positive, including sustainability benefits and other environmental benefits. So I think that's one way of doing it. But you're absolutely right. We need to work with the tools that we have, and we're not rewriting the treaties and granting necessarily those competencies to the EU anytime soon. But I think we need to really think about also, and I think this may be the nice way to end, because there's a sort of bigger question on the future of the EU. And I have never been a strong federalist. I thought the intergovernmentalist model has served us really well, but we also live in a very different environment today. And when it comes to issues like national security, there are many domains where we actually need more integration. And even if it doesn't mean that we probably don't get to European army, we may need to think about joint procurement of key military technologies in a way that makes it more feasible for the Europeans to invest at the level that we can pool the resources. So you think about some ways that may fall short of the kind of federalist vision that is still politically more palatable, but that really pursues those efficiency gains in a way that I think can be more transformative. So I think that may be the one, and I think, I don't know whether it really answers your question, Jan, but I don't think we can really expect there to be a massive change in the ability of the Europeans to tax at this point, maybe somewhere further down the road.
Thank you very much. There were still questions, if you allow us.
Good evening. My name is Aram, and I would like you to answer the following question. How does the principle of sovereignty apply in the context of regulating technology, particularly when dealing with online platforms operating across borders?
Yeah, so in many ways, technologies don't respect the borders. AI doesn't respect the borders. And if you think about these tech companies, they work across many sovereigns. And that also then means that we have these regulatory clashes. It's very hard to think about national regulation being sufficient to address them. And I think that's why the sort of the whole concept of sovereignty can be to some extent an illusion. But at the same time, I believe that the fundamental unit on which societies are built are states and governments. And these companies cannot decouple themselves from governments. They are not the new sovereigns. They do remain beholden to governments. If we ban these companies from merging, they cannot force their way into mergers. If we make these companies pay taxes, they cannot refuse to pay taxes. So ultimately, we just need to be adamant in deploying the power that we have as governments and really using the authority and to sort of asserting ourselves as sovereigns. And I think ultimately that is the way to sort of ensure that these tech companies are not the new governors. They are not the new sovereigns.
Thank you. A last question in the middle.
Hi, Professor Arnos. Really nice meeting you. My name is Ivana, and I wanted to ask you about what do you think it will happen with the underdeveloped countries, like their behavior, their response, as this change of digital transformation is more focused, like on the economical and political powerful countries, such as, for example, Italy, Spain, Latin America, and South America. What would happen with them?
Yes, so I think there are several developing countries that are to some extent at the mercy of empires. They are not in the position to truly make their own strategic choices. They don't have the regulatory capacity to write their own rules. It's easier for them to copy those rules by somebody who's invested in studying and deliberating those rules. So I think that's, to some extent, there are developing countries that just do that. India doesn't need to do that. Brazil doesn't need to do that. They have enough of heft to more strategically sort of pick elements of different empires. So India, for instance, has pretty much followed the GDPR, but then they have taken very China-like data localization provisions. So they've been more strategic in devising the model that serves the country's strategic interest. But then there are smaller countries that are, I think, at the mercy of their geography, where their economic opportunities are. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea that if China is providing them the infrastructure that they can afford, that is the infrastructure that they go for. So I think in that sense, if I were a developing country that did not really have all that independent capacity, what you could do is to try to play off the empires, to basically say that this is what China is offering, and ask the EU, so if we don't take China, what can you offer us? So what would it entail for us if we have a deeper relationship with the EU's tech ecosystem? How can you help us afford the European digital infrastructure? If you can't subsidize that, what else does it mean in terms of our access to the European market? What does it mean in terms of our diplomatic protections, our national security protections, anything that we can get? So I think that's the only conversation that they can have unless they develop their own technologies. I think AI here is huge. In many ways, there is this idea that if we believe in open source AI models, it allows us to mitigate some of the asymmetries in economic development, including then make sure we democratize this technology by giving developing countries access to it. Then there are others who say that that's probably the greatest potential opportunity of open source models, but it's the biggest vulnerability because it's not only developing countries that get access to it, it's also the bad actors that get access to it. So it also makes us more vulnerable if we don't control that access. So I don't think there's any panacea, but ultimately I am very conscious of the need for the Europeans to also realize that the global south matters a great deal. Come 2050, every fourth person in the world comes from Africa. And Europeans don't want it to be 2050 and then realize that China has basically geostrategically seized the entire market opportunities and politically aligned the entire important region with China's interests. So I think the Europeans also need to be much more mindful of the challenges and opportunities and the importance of the global south, for global south's sake, but also I think for our own sake.
Very wise words, and in a way, this evening you have basically given us a whole new agenda for the next European Commission, because it is about internal lawmaking, it is about external instruments, development aid, the global gateway. All these things need to be carefully rethought in order to make sure that we also continue to play a valuable role and a good role in the world. So thank you again very much, Anu Bradford, for an excellent engagement with all of us. Again.
Thank you so much. Excellent, excellent questions. Really enjoyed the engagement. And my very best wishes for your studies. And do write a lot about digital economy. There's so much to say about that. And it is extremely exciting topic to work on. So thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.